urban and biopolitical implications of data centers. And since the talk is entitled Between Human and Posthuman, I would like to take a moment to set a framework for this term. I assume everyone in this room has some idea of what human means. So let us talk about what posthuman might possibly be. Let us start by saying that the concept of the posthuman encompasses in itself more than just human-like cyborgs. It's a broader paradigm shift that questions the anthropocentric, or in other words, human-oriented status quo. Posthuman term is characterized by the concern for countering the hegemony of anthropos relative to other forms of non-human life. Posthumanism thus appeared as a new critical epistemology that not only combined a variety of anti-humanist and post-anthropocentric positions, but also attempted to exceed the terms of this binary scheme. This is a tough pill to swallow for the humankind who is used to being the center of the universe ever since Renaissance, humanism down to Enlightenment and later modernity. Architecture historian and theorist Benjamin Bratton calls this a Copernican trauma. Nevertheless, let us not get swung to the other extreme usually portrayed in sci-fi pop culture, like robots taking over and erasing human culture entirely. What we see instead is the beginning of a long process of human and post-human symbiosis. We try to have a closer understanding of human and non-human agents in order to project possible futures, where these different agents interact in a productive manner. Ideas around this topic vary from object-oriented ontologies, speculative realism, actor network theories, etc. However, as I will argue later, this discourse happened in niches of architectural academia, while it should be in the core of its industry. So why is this so important all of a sudden? As we'll see, the post-human phenomena is not something from the distant future. It's a part of the cities we live in today. However, most of us seem to be uncritical of this new condition. So in order to have an understanding of what this human-post-human relationship could look like, I would like to talk about specific typology that mingles between human and post-human, namely the data centers. I will proceed by analyzing the human and then post-human characteristics of this typology, so we can start thinking of how these emerging hybrid types will reshape our understanding of architecture, cities, and biopolitics. So the data centers are an interesting case study because, first of all, it is the first distinct typology to emerge in the 21st century. Its underlying logic that constitutes its physical appearance and characteristic is non-human since they're not physically designed by humans. However, they're deeply rooted in the human environment as such. Data centers have been here for long enough for most of us to have an idea about them. So I was curious to see what a Google search on data centers, or the so-called cloud, would look like. And as you see, the results are at best kind of disappointing. And I started thinking about why is it that we're having such a hard time visualizing them. I'll argue later that this is because they operate at scales where conventional architectural language basically collapses. So, as we said before, even though data center is in some way a post-human typology, it does not exist in a vacuum. Rather, it is grounded in particular human localities. It is data in its most vernacular form. We must try to avoid putting these typologies in the same category as those that Marc Augé famously described as known places. The geographic location of the data center is influenced by things like tax incentives, cost of electricity, cost of land, climate, proximity to fiber optic infrastructure, and so on and so forth. These factors of place occur at regional, infrastructural, jurisdictional, and even geological scales. Even though today we stream most of our information wirelessly, that information actually uses fiber optic infrastructure to reach us. And as customers demand ever-growing speeds, data centers tend to physically shift closer to its customers. And well, this in turn creates these hubs like the one in London, Houston, Amsterdam, and Singapore. The interesting part is that over the years, the number of data centers has declined. But the total area has gone up from 1.8 billion square feet in 2013 to almost 2 billion in 2018. Well, this is important since it has several political and urban implications. First of all, even though we talk about democratization of internet, a physical clustering of these data centers around the central hubs privileges big companies over others. Moreover, in the neoliberal economy driven by market needs, there's limited urban legislation concerning how these emerging and space-hungry forms will be integrated into urban and suburban environments. Well, one of the most genius and misleading metaphors created by this neoliberal capitalist economy is the very metaphor of the cloud and the environmentally friendly internet. We're pushed towards the paperless lifestyle, but few of us talk about the fact that many data centers use as much electricity as a small town, and it's usually generated from non-renewable energy sources. As Alain Anlarge from the French Bureau of Energy points out, a single email, just an email, with an attachment is a rough equivalent to a high-wattage light bulb burning for an hour. This is simply the cost of sending, not talking about the amount of energy required for storage and backup. So think about all of the emails you've ever sent, all of the videos that you watch on YouTube daily, and all of your work that you're storing on Google Drive. So how is this even financially viable if it uses so much energy? Well, when Thomas Edison's company created the light bulb, they were faced with the problem that consumers only ever needed to use electricity at night. But running electricity generator plants was incredibly expensive and only financially viable if the public could be persuaded to purchase and use electrical goods throughout the day. By producing and extensively marketing such goods, a lifestyle was thus created based around the constant consumption of electricity and connection to the electrical grid. Similarly, the cloud is not just infrastructure, but it's also a lifestyle, sold to us and defined by ideologies of seamless continuity and constant connectivity in form of smart cities, cloud applications, and all-you-can-eat data plans. All of these ensure the continued extraction of data from increasingly intimate and previously inaccessible areas of everyday life. Media theorist Mel Hogan notes that the infrastructural excess of multi-data centers does not simply respond to increasing demand for cloud consumption, but also actively participates in producing this demand. And considering the pace of this expansion, it's not hard to imagine the proliferation of different ways this digital culture and its physical typologies will colonize our urban space in some shape or form. We already talked about the social, economic, and geopolitical aspects of data centers. Now I want to talk a bit about the architectural typology itself. Data centers are an unprecedented architectural type built by humans for non-humans. As Liam Young beautifully puts it, we're surplus to the practical needs of a data center. It's a landscape filled with our digital avatars, but strangely absent of people. This is true considering the fact that a single person can operate around 25,000 racks within a data center. Here I want to go back to the question I posed earlier. Why do we have a hard time visualizing the essence of data centers? Like if we had to use the famous architectural party press diagram to show the main idea of the building, what it is that we would show. The problem may be that we still approach these types from an entirely anthropocentric point of view. We as humans tend to appreciate architecture that fits the scale of our bodies, our understanding of beauty, our way of communication, and most of all our epistemology, how we acquire knowledge about the world around us. But what happens when we, as architects, apply the same techniques we apply to human-oriented public buildings to post-human private typologies? So this is Snoeda's data center on the left that looks more like a community center sprinkled with greenery, happy kids, and basketball courts. Alternatively, the one in China, the one on the right, that is made to look like a parametric spaceship because for us, it happens to be associated with futurity. As good as it may look, we need to understand that these tricks do not align with the complexity of underlying typology. One may be tempted into asking, well, why cannot we have exteriors of these buildings fit our aesthetic needs, while the interiors will be arranged according to other principles? Well, because you get something like this. Yes, we are basically the kids. So the point is that we cannot do this because treating them as decorated sheds only perpetuates the primitive understanding of the cloud that big corporations are trying to promote. We as architects, along with a myriad of different professionals, have an ethical responsibility to preserve the integrity of these emerging hybrid typologies and educate people about the complex ways we interact with them daily. we need to talk not about aesthetics, but protocols and procedures. As urbanist and technologist Yanis Orfanos puts it, an infrastructure system consists not only of physical structure, but also of operating procedures, administrations, bylaws, natural processes, and equally important, the end user. So then how do we interact with it? Let us start with a semi-anecdotal case of a Bitcoin mine in the distant mountains of Sichuan province. Situated here because of cheap hydroelectric power, unlike its Western brothers, this building is stripped of all aesthetic and even sanitary concerns, and run by a few part-time workers who are idly waiting for something to go wrong. The relationship between goats and bitcoins may not be immediately apparent, but here in Jiangsu Prefecture, a herd gathers beside a cooling fan of a cryptocurrency mine. Unaware of the complex mathematical equations being solved on the other side of the wall, they seem to be enjoying the cool breeze on a hot summer day. This may sound as something primitive and not scalable, but in fact the reuse of excess energy coming from data centers is becoming a common practice in Scandinavia today. However, these, I believe, are still scratching the surface of the full potential of possible synergies. Today we see most of the post-human typologies developing mostly within the bubble of the factory, where they're sheltered from vandalism and expectations of how occupied areas should be programmed. One of the potential outcomes of automation at an urban scale is bringing automated factory logic into the city, which in turn means that we would have to learn to live with, and sometimes in, human exclusion zones. But even as some factory protocols seep into everyday life, at a regional scale, the boundaries may be hardened. That is, the differentiation between urban cores as a front stage zone for human residence and entertainment versus rural peripheral backstage zones for automated agriculture, manufacturing, logistics, and energy harvesting is drawn more distinctly. While membranes between human zone and human exclusion zones are fortified, this is not the same as clear delineation between city and a countryside as territorial typologies. It's all a city in different shades and stripes and relative densities. At the sprawling edge where food and energy come from, backstage urban mega interiors can look more like a engineering in a petri dish rather than architecture. And Benjamin Brattensee continues by saying that we do not have a nuanced language to describe these typologies in their own terms, because even so-called industrial architecture, where many of these exciting technological and intellectual disciplinary problems are now situated, has very little prestige. We can go even further into speculating how our urban space will change. A sci-fi writer, Stanley Robinson, points out that the extreme of human exclusion zones is recommended by setting half of the Earth's surface aside for recovery, rewilding, remediation, repair, and return to other evolutionary selection pressures. This, coupled with Bernard Stiegler's neganthropocene, may result in the subsequent concentration, and I tried to make this as clear as possible, but the subsequent concentration of the human terrestrial domain into denser urban apparatuses, inclusive of their own narrowly defined smaller exclusion zones, would contain us in a synthetic garden surrounded immediately by automated landscapes and at a further distance by other ecologies with trajectories of their own. All of these relationships and conditions open up a lot of exciting possibilities and challenges, from new variations on Foucauldian biopolitics and A.L. Wisman's politics of architecture, explorations of different natures as a result of different techno-natural symbioses, redefinition of physical, private, and public space in relation to the understanding of the private and public in digital realm, smart cities, data gathering, and consequent privatization of urban space by big corporation. These are only some of the exciting implications of this newly emerging myriad of possible outcomes and scenarios that would need to be analyzed separately. Once a definition of a new territory has been outlined, we as humans need to come to some consensus on what to do next. Do we go to war with the machine Do we colonize its space or sneak our way in? Or do we stand at the edges and watch from afar? The default position of architecture profession seems to be to try to claim its lost territory, to sneak back in and parasitically occupy this landscape with ergonomic furniture, open-plan offices, green walls, and raw juice bars. The marquee architectures of technology are the corporate headquarters of Big and Heatherwick Studios Googleplex, Foster & Partners Apple Campus, says Liam Young. But these are not the star architects of the post-Anthropocene. They are just set dressing the waiting rooms, distracting us with expressive displays while the machine program our planet, hidden behind the windowless walls and anonymous forms. While machine burned down the house, we're still worried about the shape of its roof. In these new landscapes, the poetics of human occupation are extraneous. The scale of the body is immaterial, and we must explore new forms of productive engagement with the non-human world. Machine landscape of the post-Anthropocene are already here, critical and fundamental, embedded in the ground of the earth and the fabric of a planetary city. Their cooling fans spin, the electromagnetics hum, the LEDs flicker, and it smells of rare earth. Machines are making the world, and we are on the outside, peering in, faces pressed to the glass windows of an empty control room. Thank you.